Good evening, everyone. I know the veterans stood before, but once again, if those of you who were served in the military or currently serving in the military or the National Guard, Vietnam, Korea, World War II, peacetime, anytime, if you would you please stand? I will tell you, welcome home. Those of us who served in Vietnam, we say welcome home to each other because oftentimes no one said welcome home to us when we came home because of the division which was in this country. They asked me if I would just say a couple of things before we introduce Lynn and Ron. Every day I think of Vietnam a little bit. There's always something that takes place. This morning I thought of the flight attendant on a Continental Airlines that took me to Vietnam in September of 1967. So many men were going to Vietnam at that time that they had to use chartered airplanes. So I left from San Francisco on a Continental stretch jet filled with GIs, all of us going to different places in Vietnam. And what I remember is the flight attendant, once we landed in Vietnam, the pilot actually came on the radio and said, "Gentlemen, I'm going to bring her in rather steeply. We're going to just be up here and we're going to drop it in very quickly because we often get small arms fire from the enemy. They know we're coming and they know we're loaded with GIs coming to fight the war in Vietnam." So we were up here and then we just dropped in like that. As we got off the plane, that flight attendant, I remember, she was blonde. She had on a pink and yellow scarf around her neck. She was in the continental colors of that time. I think they were brown and gold, something like that. And she had tears in her eyes. And she hugged every one of us, or touched every one of us as we left that door to go into the heat of Vietnam, that September 17th, 1967, because she knew that some of those men would not come home. And some of us did not come home, 59,000. This morning I thought of my friend Randall Lee Williams, 21 years old, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, who died with 57 days to go in the Army, not let alone Vietnam, but in the Army. That was in 1968 he died. In 2003, I went to the virtual website where you can look at the Vietnam Wall and look up a name and leave some words on that virtual website. And I talked about Randall Lee Williams, the kind of man he was. Years later, his sister and his mother and father found that website where I had written what I wrote. And they've contacted me and we've been in touch with each other ever since. His father, at the age of 90, died just a couple of weeks ago, and his mother wrote me, and we have maintained a relationship. In a way, although he was in our unit, I knew him very well. In a way, I think she kind of adopted me over the years because Randy and I were the same age, and he would be my age today had he lived. That's what I think about when I think about Vietnam on this day. Thank you for asking me to moderate this. I appreciate it, all the people here at ideastream. It's wonderful to be here and to be a part of this program. For the next 20 minutes, we're going to talk to Lynn about making the film and with Ron Schwachenwald about his experience in Vietnam and his reflections about the 30-minute screening we just watched. We're going to then take your questions, so you should have received a note card upon entering the theater today. Please write your questions on those note cards and pass them to the aisle, and somebody will grab them, and we will try and get to as many questions as we can. Lynn Novick is the co-director, along with Ken Burns, of the Vietnam War an immersive 10-part, 18-hour documentary which airs on PBS in September 2017. She's an Emmy and Peabody Award-winning documentary maker. For nearly 30 years, she's been producing and directing films about American history and culture, among them some of the most acclaimed and top-rated documentaries to have aired on PBS. Her films include Prohibition, Baseball, Jazz, Frank Lloyd Wright, and The War, a 7-part, 15-hour exploration of ordinary Americans' experiences in World War II. Ladies and gentlemen, Lynn Novick. Ron Schwachenwald is a retired U.S. Army colonel, served in the U.S. Army for 34 years, two tours of duty in Vietnam. His awards include the Legion of Merit, Distinguished Flying Cross for Heroism, Air Medal for Valor, 16 Air Medals, a Purple Heart, and a Master Aviation Wings. Since retiring from the Army in 1994, Ron Schwachenwald has held many positions in the private, non-private, and public sectors at the executive level. He is one of our neighbors. He too is from Northeast Ohio. Ladies and gentlemen, Ron Schwachenwald. Lynn, let's start with you. Why did you and Ken Burns want to make this film?
Well, I think we had this sense that this war and its aftermath and everything that led up to it are sort of unfinished business for our country. It's, I would use the metaphor, kind of a raw nerve or a festering wound, something like that, that it's just there kind of cooking away, and that we are sort of suffering from a kind of a national amnesia about what actually happened, and having very heated arguments about all kinds of things, some of which have a lot to do with what actually happened, but we don't, it's sort of obscure to us at this point. And so we hope that we could sort of go back to the beginning and relearn it if we thought we knew, and then also find out what we didn't know, kind of unpack it as you saw in that kind of backwards montage, just pick it apart and put it back together. And it was important to us that we take our time and sort of let go of whatever preconceptions we had and take a look at this with an open mind and an open heart, and not judge, and just be open to what stories we could find. And then I think one of the central motivating forces for us was that when Americans think about the Vietnam War, we think about America. And of course, we are Americans, and that's what affected us, but we didn't think we could actually understand it if we didn't try to understand what happened to the Vietnamese and in Vietnam on all sides.
Is that why you decided to put the Vietnamese perspective in this film, even the North Vietnamese perspective in this?
They were our enemies and our allies. I don't think we knew much about either side, to be honest. Certainly not much about the winning side. They were very mysterious to us and to our leaders. And we, because relations have been normalized with Vietnam for 20 years, it's possible to go there. And we had incredible access to meet whoever we wanted to talk to and ask them whatever we wanted to ask them. And we were able to come back with some extraordinary testimony. So to be able to integrate that story with the story of Americans going through this extremely traumatic event, it felt to us that we could perhaps, we were never going to find closure. This is not a story that you're ever going to get to the bottom of. I think questions just lead to more questions and deeper questions. But we could at least open up a conversation that we haven't had.
What surprised you about what you found when you got into this project?
Pretty much everything. Because I thought I knew quite a lot about the Vietnam War. I'm a little bit too young to have been an adult. I was born in 1962. So I remember it, but I wasn't really aware of all the deep, prehistory of it. But there's a lot of new scholarship. There's a lot of new perspectives. There's people who have studied this who are not politically driven in any way, shape, or form, who just have tried to find out the facts of what happened. A lot of material has been declassified. There's access in Vietnam to all kinds of interesting documents and testimony, and so pretty much every day was a surprise. And one of the things that surprised us, which we sort of marvel at, was that we didn't really know, and our leaders did not know who was actually sort of most powerful in calling the shots in North Vietnam and Hanoi. Everyone here, I'm sure, most people have heard of Ho Chi Minh. Very familiar figure. He was the icon of their revolution. But after 1954, he began to lose power. And by the time America was fully involved, he was not directing policy in Hanoi. There's another man named Le Duan, who I had never heard of when we started this project. And he was much more aggressive and hardcore, hardliner than Ho Chi Minh. And he took over the just sort of direction of the Politburo.
Yeah.
I did not know that. So that's just one little story, but rather important.
Let's bring Ron Schwachenwald into the conversation. They talked about the Battle of Can Tien. You and I were sitting up there and you whispered in my ear, I was there. How does this film resonate with you?
It's the beginning of the story of Can Tien. A few months later, Can Tien was invaded by 2 North Vietnam regular regiments, approximately 6,000 men. It was a special forces camp. The Marine Corps was supporting it. We happened to be building the McNamara line, which was a line that was going to have spent uranium, and it was going to deter the North Vietnamese from coming down and taking part in the actions in South Vietnam. The 2 regiments came on board, but happily and luckily, we had a CB battalion there, functioning, expanding the camp, reinforcing the camp. We also had 2 tank battalions that were South Vietnamese. If that was not the case, we would not have survived, and no one would be here to talk about Can Tien. So that's the other side of the story. We were successful in deterring it. A long, long story, 16 hours staying awake, both flying and helping people, watching people. 3 things you learned at Can Tien: how to live, how to love, and how to die. It was that simple. And everybody that walked away that day prayed that they were still there, but I've held people there that died in my arms. So functionally, you look at those kind of things, and that gives you a perspective for the rest of your life and how to treat people with respect.
That is something that you bring away from war. At least most of us, I think, bring away from war. This is a many parts
Yes.
series, hours and hours
Yes.
and hours. How do you make a film on this scale? Where do you begin?
Right.
What's the process? What happens going into this
Yes.
huge amount of video possibilities and everything? Where do you begin?
Well, the first thing I need to say is that Ken and I, you'll see our names on the poster and everything as the directors of the film, and we do get a lot of credit for what you see, but actually there's many people who contribute, and the most tireless researchers that we have are producers that go into every archive around the world and collect material. Our writer, Jeff Ward, who wrote a brilliant script, our narrator, Peter Coyote, and our editors who take this material and distill it down to something that you can actually watch. So there's many, many people involved, and we benefit from all of their genius and dedication. And I think because on this project we were given such extraordinary testimony, and it felt important that we try to get it right for them, everyone on the team really just sort of went above and beyond in terms of just trying to understand this complicated story. We started off deciding, first of all, that we were going to try to understand, make a film that would represent the story of the war through the eyes of people who lived through it. So there are many well-known figures of this era that you will see in the film, but we did not interview them. So I'm talking about John Kerry and John McCain, Henry Kissinger, Jane Fonda. I'm sure many people here have their list of who those people would be, people you're familiar with. They're in the film, archivally doing what they did at the time. But we did not interview them because we wanted to hear from people who you don't know, for the most part. So that was a sort of organizing principle. Then once we had testimony, we had to find pictures and footage and music, and we had to put it into a cohesive narrative over time. The first draft of our script was enough, it was 400 pages, it would have been a 50-hour film. So if we had actually made that film, I don't know when it would have ever gotten finished. So part of it is a process of distilling. And part of our job is to recruit the foremost experts in the subject, from America, from Vietnam, people who know this aspects of the story, and they come to screenings and they look at scripts and they help us get the story right.
I think what impresses me was, as opposed to the Civil War, where you had to go,
Right.
or Ken Burns had to go to historians.
Right,
There
to
are
tell the
people-
story.
To tell
Right.
the story. There are people living, walking around in this room, I mean, in this world that you can go to, and
Right.
does that give it a poignancy?
I would say it does. I mean, I wish I had a camera for the story you were just telling. I think that people who live through it have, a direct relationship to the events. And if you're reading words on a page, no matter how great an actor you are, not the same.
Yeah.
There's just, no time, an individual bearing witness to something that they experienced puts you in their mind at that place, at that time, if you find the right witnesses. So, not everyone who had an experience can tell you about it, as you well know.
Yeah.
But when you find the people who can and will, that's an extraordinary, sort of transcendent experience, actually.
Ron, you heard the former Marine who was talking to his mother, telling
Roger
her,
Harris.
"I'm not
Right.
coming. I'm not coming home," and then hung up on his mother. I guess on the telephone or some sort of communications. How did that resonate with you? How did that hit you as a two-tour Vietnam veteran? What he said.
In my mind, that was me. Same anticipation by my mom and dad. I happened to have a profound incident my last tour. I was in the hospital. I called my mom and I didn't call my dad. My dad called the White House.
Oh, wow.
And I had a phone call. Obviously, they were military liaison officers, but I got a call from the White House. They didn't call your dad. And he was already on the phone. They had it already taken care of. Profound.
He took care of it.
Yes, they did.
Well, I don't think we realize, I think people today don't understand how rare it was to talk on the phone from Vietnam.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, nowadays our soldiers overseas can Skype and whatever, but
I never spoke to anybody on the phone.
I'm sure, right, it was very unusual.
I spent
Yeah.
my first wedding anniversary in Vietnam. The first 2 years of marriage, we were together only 2 months.
Wow.
In the first 2 years of our marriage, we're still together, by the way.
It's beautiful.
And it's a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah. We have, interviewed a number of families. So we have obviously combat veterans in the film, but the woman that you saw who protested in 1969, her brother was in Vietnam, and the family talked about how hard it was, just getting a letter once in a while, and in between letters not knowing what happened.
You touched upon in your earlier comments before we looked at the film, you touched upon the comments on PBS. Why, and expound upon that a little bit. Why PBS and why not another network?
Well, I think the absence of commercial considerations is the most important thing. It's public media. We are not driven by ratings, by commercials, by a profit. We're just, have this extraordinary window through which we can share these really important stories and tell them the way that they should be told, honestly and authentically. And that's just rare. You can turn the dial. I mean, I do turn the dial. There's nowhere else on the dial that you can find that kind of free expression and place where you can allow for sustained attention that way without commercial interruption and without having to pay for it.
You want people to talk about this. What process do you go through to get this discussion out there in America?
Well, we're counting on all of you to start to be evangelists for that, honestly. I mean, in some sense, we have a very ambitious plan for outreach to bring the film to schools all around the country and to help foster community conversations. And my dream is that the kind of conversations we're going to have as a country will be remarkable based on the experiences we've had in our edit room when we brought people in to see the film. And for example, I was just thinking about it today, Hal Kushner, who you saw, and Roger Harris both came to a screening. And they could not be more different politically in their experiences of the war and their feelings about it to this day. And Carl Marlantis was there too, the Marine that you saw at the beginning, along with a very sort of committed anti-war protester and a 4-star general. And they watched the whole film, and after every episode we had extraordinarily open, frank conversations. They disagreed about very fundamental things sometimes, but they were able to talk to each other in a way that I have rarely seen in our public life, and I think it's because of the way the film unfolds the story and the way that people are so generous to be honest and forthright, that our viewers seem to have that same impulse. It sort of opens us up. And so, we're hoping it's going to have an effect on families and communities and across many divides. One of my favorite experiences that we had in working on the film was, we've had young people come in who were working on our digital marketing and our website and things like that. And a guy came to a screening who was in his late 20s, and we saw 2 episodes. He went home and came back the next day, and he said, "Oh, I called my dad last night." Great. So I call my dad, a couple times a week, and I usually say, "Hey, Dad, what's up with the Mets? How was work? Okay, bye, I gotta go." The little 2-minute conversation he has with his dad. He said, "But last night I called my dad and I said, wait a minute, this Vietnam thing, where were you? What happened to you? What do you remember?" And he said 45 minutes later they were still talking. Right. And it opened up a conversation that he'd never had with his father, who was not a veteran, but who remembered this period, and it was real for him. And I just think we have a chance, to foster a different kind of conversation intimately in families, in communities, in schools, and maybe in our public life as well.
I have an employee I work with. In fact, he's my supervisor, news director at Channel 5, and he and I were talking the other day. And I don't think he would mind my saying this, but after a long conversation where we talked about everything that's happening in our lives, in our newsroom and professional lives, he laid back in his chair, younger than I am, and he just quietly said, "Leon," I said, "Yes." "Tell me about Vietnam." He wanted to know. And that's all he said.
Wow.
And then, of course, I did 2 hours.
Yeah. No, he's lucky.
And still didn't.
That's great.
Do you see similarities, Ron Schwachenwald? You've got more than 30 years in the U.S. military and the U.S. Army. You are a decorated veteran. 2 tours of duty in Vietnam during the height of the war. Do you see similarities with what happened then and anything happening now?
The best thing I can explain to you, about a week from now, I'm going to go to a Vietnam Helicopter Pilots Association reunion. There we have North Vietnamese pilots, from South Vietnam, from Australia, from Korea,
Wow.
and us guys.
Wow.
But 2 years ago, I took my wife, and she'd never wanted to go there. She says, "That much time in the military and being married to you for 47 years, that's way too long to talk about anything." But we got there a little early, and a bunch of us guys got together with our wives. We went to this little pub. It was in Fort Worth, and we started talking. After 2 hours of conversation, she says, "I've been married to you for 47 years, and I never knew you." That's how much you learned in that short time. But in my mind, no news was good news as far as family's concerned. Right. And I think that's still the motto out there for most people in the service.
Yeah, I think so too.
And I want to just say one more thing. I think, one of the hopes we have really is that, there were many people in America who served, and we absolutely owe it the debt of gratitude that we talked about before, and it's the most important thing that we can do as a society. But there also were many Americans who really thought the war was wrong, didn't agree with our government, had thought about it a lot. There were soldiers who came home and disagreed with what was happening. I've talked to many veterans who feel like I wasn't really sure why we were there. Several gentlemen said that to me today. And I was drafted, I had to go, and I did the best I could, but I'm not sure it was the right thing. And it's a lot of questioning. And I know we're near where Kent State is, and what an effect that tragedy had on our society. That it's part of the unfinished business is to talk about the combat experience and what it was like for all of you to come home and not be welcomed properly or have a place to talk. But also for the people who disagreed about the war then, to try to find a way to let's say, how do I say this? There's a way that we don't have to necessarily pick one person's right and one person's wrong. Yeah. It's a little bit more complicated than that. I think the film gives us a chance to do that.
Before we take questions from the audience, and I think that we're on time to do that, I want to squeeze in one more with you. Do you worry of another Vietnam?
I think that was of a particular time and place, and that exact thing will not happen again. But it's difficult to hold on to the lessons that get learned, because each new generation seems to have to find its own way. So I worry about all kinds of things right now in the world, to be honest. So, yeah.
We want to take a few questions. I mean, do we have questions from our audience?
Here we go.
Here we go. Thank you.
This reunion with North Vietnamese pilots was fascinating. Yes.
Well, they are here.
Fantastic. It's incredible.
I'll introduce you to WVIZ.
Yes, please do. Yeah.
Lynn, this 30 minutes of preview had an incredible impact on me. What impact did it have on you personally?
Making the film, I presume, it had a huge impact on me and everyone else, on Ken and our producer, Sarah Botstein, everyone. We just, we all kind of overwhelmed and humbled. And sometimes I felt, I did many of the interviews in the film, most of the ones I think that you saw here, and particularly doing that was just a very profound experience of being present while people told you things that they don't always tell, even people closest to them. And there were times I had to just go lie down afterwards. I actually couldn't talk for quite a long time, just trying to understand what I had just been told and how are we going to make a film that would be represent that depth of human experience. But I think the thing that I take away from the whole tragedy of Vietnam, and to me it is a tragedy with enormous heroism and valor and sacrifice and love and courage, and also incredible dark things that people do to each other. Having been present for most of the testimony in the film and many other people, I've developed a deep appreciation for the resilience of the human spirit, how we do somehow endure, and part of it is in finding the way to tell your story.
In the human spirit?
Yeah, that
endures.
Yeah, I mean that there's an incredible strength in just trying to figure out how to explain what you felt, what happened to you, and make sense of it. As Max Phelan said at the beginning, this to live is to suffer, to survive is to find meaning in the suffering. I think I've sort of absorbed that idea through the making of this film in a way that I never could have understood before.
Ron, we got a question for you. Someone asks, what was the most difficult moment in the war for you? And also the most uplifting moment in the war for you?
I think the most uplifting was a camaraderie, learning to love your neighbor, your friend, your brother as a service member. Sometimes that meant the difference between life and death, and a psychological thought process that would make it negative or positive. I think the most difficult, and there were several of them, was an incident that took place in the southern part of Vietnam, and it was recovering some Air Force pilots. And we were successful at the mission, but the Air Force pilots weren't alive. And the function that I had as a pilot versus what Leon did, Leon was on the ground 100% of the time. He lived, he ate, and he breathed everything that you could possibly think of as an infantryman. I was at a different level in that I was in the sky. I saw the circumstances. I saw the incidents occur, terrible things occur. But I wasn't as close to him. I didn't feel I was as part of it as you did, Leon. And I think that bothered me a lot too.
Lynn, they want to know, what was the most difficult moment in making this film, and what was the most uplifting moment?
Okay. Well, I'd say before I made my first trip to Vietnam, I don't think I slept for a month. I was so anxious that how are we going to go there? I don't speak the language. I don't understand the place. How are we going to go there and find people to talk to and try to, extract something that would be meaningful, that wouldn't just be sort of the superficial propaganda version of the war. We really wanted to get deep into the human story of it. And I found the first trip I made very difficult. I went into a room with a whole room full of decorated veterans that the government thought, or that someone thought would be good for me to talk to. And basically each person stood up and basically told the same speech about how they beat us, and basically just literally from a script. And I thought, okay, this is not going to work. It was a very difficult moment of just, I don't know, I don't think we're going to be able to do this. And there was one veteran there who didn't read off the script, and he's one of the great people in the film. So there was a little bright light, but yeah. I mean, but that's kind of a silly thing to say. I think, many people took huge risks in really unburdening themselves of some stories they've been carrying. And there are many of them in the film, and each one I felt was hard for them and difficult for us.
Which opens the door for this question just come in. Who was less reticent or more open with their thoughts, the Vietnamese or the American veterans?
I'd say it's about the same. I would say veterans the world over probably have similar experience of finding that the civilians can't understand what you've been through, and therefore they might say they want you to tell them what it was like, but then they sort of shut down and don't actually want to know. And in Vietnam, it's, I think, compounded by the scale of the tragedy that their country went through. Just the numbers are sort of staggering, but if you think about a country of 30 million, North and South being combined now, but let's say there are 30 million Vietnamese, and 3 million died approximately. It's hard to know the exact number, but that's 1/10 of the population. So when you go to Vietnam, every single person knows somebody who died. Mm-hmm. So that is, so there's a reticence to actually delve into and open up that question.
One of the people asks here, who did you look to for advice? Did advice come from when you're talking to Vietnamese? That opens a door, which opens another door, which opens another door.
Sometimes, yeah.
Was it like that?
Yeah, the same as we do here. We found people to talk to pretty much the same way, word of mouth, or someone might have published an article, or we found a couple that both worked on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. She drove a truck and he drove a bulldozer in different sections of the trail, and they met, fell in love. These are ordinary soldiers also drafted into the North Vietnamese Army, right? And they were apart for 6 years, not one letter, not one word, they were engaged. And then they didn't know the other one, if whichever one was alive or not, both under getting bombed. And then they we met after the war and married and lived happily ever after. And we found them because of an article in a local newspaper there, so.
Have you gone back to Vietnam, Ron?
No, I haven't.
Would you like to?
I'd love to, if you go.
If I go, we've talked.
We made a deal, Joe.
There's somebody here who has gone.
30 sometimes. Yes.
Joe Meisner is here, and he's gone
There's several
30 sometimes.
people here,
He's
yeah.
with us. He's with us today, Vietnam veteran himself. And
Well, I will say one thing I discovered that I thought was very interesting was that long before our government and Vietnam normalized relations in 1994, it was American veterans that started going back individually and connecting with ordinary Vietnamese soldiers and just trying to figure out what happened and kind of not make peace on a governmental level, but for themselves. And that sort of opened up doors, I think, for ultimately some kind of reconciliation.
Lynn, what was it like working with Ken Burns?
Well, Ken and I have been working together for a very long time. So on this project, it was extraordinary, and every film we've made together has been a gift. We have, I think, a great collaboration. There's a lot of mutual respect, and we challenge each other to think hard and to be creative and to be tough on the film and on, what are we doing, and is this really as good as we can make it, and what can we do to make it better, and how can we help our team do better? So, I think in the end, we laugh a lot and we argue a lot, and we basically sort of eat, sleep, and breathe the subject and the film for as long as we're working on it. And the sad truth is that when it's over, people say, aren't you glad you're so, enough with the Vietnam War already, you must be so sick of it. And we're usually just bereft. I mean, just so sad that we're not working on it anymore and don't get to do this particular collaboration. I mean, we will collaborate, we will continue to collaborate, but this particular project was really special. So I think we're really sad that we're not actually in the edit room anymore, trying to make the film better.
Ron, from what you've seen of the 30-minute preview that we just saw, what do you take away from this film? And what, looking into your crystal ball, what do you think you will take away from the entire series?
I appreciate what you're doing, number one, because it's telling our story, and maybe it'll sustain that story for the next 50 years so our children's children can understand a little better what we did, not just as soldiers, but as families, as neighbors, as part of the community. My difference was I spent a long time in the service. Leon was in for 3 years. And most of the people that you meet that are or were in Vietnam, and currently some of the service members, they come back and for the rest of their life they remember one thing, their military service. So that I'm very proud of. Talking to a lot of my friends that were in Vietnam the last few weeks, one told me, he says, tell the folks, I went there, I loved my country, I thought we were going to do a service because we were told the issue was communism. And we had this domino effect. And if Vietnam falls, the rest of that part of the world would fail. He later, and you know Tom Sweeney is the individual that asked me to tell this story, he said, later on he got discouraged. He fought a war, he saw no end, he tried to believe in what he was doing, and still to this day believes what he gave as far as his time, and the sacrifices he made, not just for himself but for his family, were well worthwhile. And I still believe that in my heart, that my family, I don't know if my wife will ever forgive me after 58 years, but certainly understand what we were involved in. But that story has to go not just for us. Less than 0.5% of the people in our country today are in the service. So if we can tell the stories, continue to visibly say what's happening in Afghanistan, Iraq, and 197 other countries that we happen to be in right now. I think that's the
Wow.
majority of countries in the world.
197?
197 different countries.
Wow.
So there's a story. Joe and I were talking yesterday, and he said, how many stories do you think there are? I said, well, just the time frame I was in Vietnam, there has to be 100 million stories because that many people were impacted.
Yeah.
And then we went on and we said, well, what's the population of Vietnam? It's 100 million people. Hard to believe that, too.
Yeah.
So, yes, the positive side's there. I think we all put the negative side out of our minds. I think the process is very simple. That, you know, if I had measles and it was terrible, I can remember getting better. So, fundamentally, I believe that's what the combat issue in my life. The other thing was, I was taught very well to survive. In the 35 years almost that I was in the service, I only practiced that twice, a year and a half in Vietnam. All the rest of my life, as far as in the military, was either teaching or being taught. And I appreciate that.
Lynn, take us home. Give us a philosophical thought on all of this, why you do this, why this is important, what that film, The Vietnam War, means. Take us out. Take us home.
Oh my goodness, that's a tall order because, you know, well, I'll say this. I think the other day, Ken and I had the incredible privilege, really overwhelming to me personally, to speak at the wall on Memorial Day.
Wow.
And we were asked to do that about a year ago, and we said, of course, we would be honored. And then for the last year, I just dreaded the experience, the possibility that we were going to stand there and try to say anything meaningful, and what right did we have to speak in that incredibly sacred place. And I did a lot of homework about the history of the wall and what Lynn was trying to do and sort of what role it has played in our country of starting this process of healing the wounds of the Vietnam War. And I think there was something very positive and sort of overwhelming about being there and seeing the names and sitting in front of us were 5 Gold Star mothers in their 90s, I've got to imagine, and many families of people who had died and whose names are on the wall. They were putting new names of people because every year, for different reasons, people sort of get certified or to have their names put on the wall. And you know, thinking about what can you possibly say to make it okay. And I was reminded of what Maya Lin said at the time, was she said she designed the wall as a place where you could have an experience, where you could get as close as you can to the dead, but you can never really be with them. And that it would be a journey that would help you go through this passage, but it wasn't ever gonna say it's all over and it's okay because it's not okay. And I carry that with me. I mean, it isn't okay. We're never going to say that the Vietnam War is okay and that it's fine and it all worked out. It's a tragedy. So it's sort of, how do we, human beings, go on living with this weight? And we do. I don't know, but we just do. And I guess that, you know, as filmmakers, we've just tried to put our arms around this epic tragedy and trauma and try to find our way through it to tell the story so that we can be okay with it, but it is not okay.
At the wall in Washington, D.C., it is black granite, those panels bearing 59,000 names almost on them. And as you look at that wall, and as I touch the names of the men that I knew who died in the war in Vietnam, because it is black granite polished, I see my own reflection staring back at me. Ladies and gentlemen, Lynn Novick and Ron Schwachenwald.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you.
I'll give it to you.